Good afternoon. Welcome to Newland Global Group Australia-India Conversations, our initiative to stimulate and enhance deliberations on the new energy in Australia-India relations. I'm Natasha Bhaskar, General Manager at the Newland Global Group. Our guest today is someone who is widely recognized for her passion for building international partnerships and creating long-term impacts, delivering insights, bridging connections, and building partnerships. That is at the very core of her work. I'm deeply privileged to have with me Penny Burtt, Group CEO of Asialink, Australia's leading center for Asia engagement. Thank you very much, Penny, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you and having this conversation.
Thank you. So tell us a bit more about yourself, what led you to join Asialink, what Asialink is all about.
Natasha, Asialink is a center for creative engagement with Asia. It was established about 30 years ago as an initiative of the Australian federal government, the Maya Foundation, one of Australia's largest family foundations, and then hosted by the University of Melbourne. Asialink runs programs in arts, diplomacy, education, and business, all designed to strengthen Australia's capacity to navigate its crucial relationships with Asia, so that we can actually build a strong, we call it a shared prosperous future. In doing that, we do three key things in Asialink. First, we work to generate insights and understanding so that in Australia, we better understand what's happening in the region, countries in our region, the regional economy, the arts and culture of our region, and so equally that the countries across our region have got a better appreciation of Australia. The second thing that we do is we focus on building capabilities. People often don't know what that means, but navigating your relationships requires all sorts of different capabilities. And we believe for Australians with Asia, we need to build our intercultural capabilities. We need to build our skills, negotiating skills. We need to change mindsets. So a good example of the sort of capability building we do is through our education programs. We work in over 23 countries in the Asia Pacific with over, I think it's currently close to 2,000 schools in the region and in Australia. And we work with teachers and school leaders, and then with some of our young people, building that really those skills to be able to engage and that global and intercultural mindset. The third thing that we do, and you noted that in your introduction, is we're actually a platform that brings people together. So we actually focus on the connections between Australia and the rest of the region. I have been with Asialink for nearly 2 years, leading the organization. Prior to that, I spent most of the last 30 years living and working in the Indo-Pacific. I spent 20 years with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, working as an Australian diplomat, and then I spent more than 10 years working with large American multinational corporations based out of Singapore with a regional remit. And during that period, I had the privilege of working, particularly in my corporate career, on major initiatives and projects in India.
Wow. So you've had a very diverse work profile. You worked for the business, you worked for the public sector as a former diplomat and also as an advisor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. You also represented Australia at the United Nations, and followed by your work also with the not-for-profit sector. From that perspective, do you think the rules of engagement, when we are talking about countries engaging with each other, the rules of engagement change when on the other side we have government, and or if we have the private businesses? How does one distinguish how to engage, and what are the little bits which we need to know when we are engaging with different people on the other side?
Natasha, that's a really great question. And people often say to me, wow, you've had so many different sort of aspects in your career. I think as we engage internationally, we should actually think about the core of what all of us do, whether we're in the public sector, the private sector, or the social sector, or in academia, is international engagement and diplomacy is actually the preserve of everybody. I mean, our diplomatic corps has an incredibly important role to play in fostering government-to-government ties, in providing the context in which our relationships happen. But actually, those relationships between countries fundamentally actually need people-to-people ties across all sectors. So core in the way that we show up and we engage should be understanding everybody has a responsibility really to make sure that the way that we're showing up and the way that we're engaging with the rest of the world is to everybody's broader interest. And it's interesting, we have so many actors in our communities who play an important role in defining who we are, what our countries stand for, and the way that we show up. So, I mean, I think Newland Global Group does a fantastic job in promoting the Australia-India relationship. You're a great example of actors who might not be sitting in government, but actually play a crucial role in our diplomacy.
Thank you so much, Penny. Also, most recently we saw the Asialink business came out with Winning in Asia report, and the report categorically states that only 7% of ASX 200 companies have actually senior executives who are Asia capable. Can you, elaborate on a bit what exactly Asia capability means, or what it is to be Asia capable?
Absolutely. So it's very interesting. The first assessment that Asialink Business did of Asia capability in the Australian corporate sector was done together with PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2013 and resulted in a seminal report called Match Fit. In Winning in Asia, we sought to update the data and take another look at Asia capability on Australian boards and in the C-suite of the ASX 200. Interestingly, not much had changed. What do we mean by Asia capability, and what are we measuring here when we say 90% of Australian boards and C-suites we couldn't judge as being fully Asia capable? The metrics that we look at in assessing Asia capability include sophisticated knowledge of Asian markets, extensive experience living and working in Asia, but really operating in Asia. Asia capability is also about having long-term and trusted relationships in the region, the ability to adapt behaviors to Asian cultural contexts, a capacity, and this is really important, to deal with government in the Indo-Pacific, and lastly, language proficiency. So all of those different elements, which track, by the way, very closely with our insights, capabilities, and connections framework for the work that we do, all of those elements we combine to develop an index for measuring Asia capability.
That's quite, I've gone through the report, and the report, very strongly delves into different aspects of engaging with the Asian nations. And I think it's for anyone who wants to expand in the Asian market must read that report. It's a must read, and it's quite, like everything which, and even with the, with the case studies, which clearly reflects also the experiences of these companies in the Asian markets. What sort of responses did you receive, Penny, from most of these Australian companies? Because most of the times we come back and hear that Asia, or in general, if we talk about India, is a very difficult market. So that's sort of an understanding about the Asian continent, or about India in general, takes away the whole business narrative from doing business easily to a difficult market, rather than understanding it as a diverse market. How do you really think these questions were addressed, and what, in your opinion, are the inhibitions that exist with the Australian corporates?
So Thank you very much, Natasha. Great question. Let me just say, in terms of framing, Winning in Asia was really a report driven by business for business, rather than an effort to create yet another set of recommendations to government on the context. We decided to really become much more granular and try and take head on all these myths that exist in corporate Australia about the difficulty of doing business in Asia. And in doing that, we took a very strong focus on case studies, getting really granular market insight, and actually bringing the voices of companies, CEOs, and of analysts to the table in a way where these practitioners could actually help share their knowledge and experience. So there were three really important things that came out of the report that have actually engendered a great response, we think, across business. The first was, with assistance from BCG, we did some very detailed analysis which effectively debunks the myth that if you invest in Asia, it's going to hurt your long-term corporate prospects, and in particular your share price. So the data shows comprehensively that actually Australian companies on the ASX 200 who have internationalized have actually done better in terms of their long-term returns than those that have not. So the idea that if you go to Asia, somehow you're going to lose money, that's actually not when you take a data-driven, fact-based approach. That's not correct. I think the second thing that we sought to address with the report was there are many, many stories about the failures of Australian business in Asia, and everybody knows the case studies. What we really set out to do was actually take a whole different lens and show what sorts of companies in all sorts of new sectors have been highly successful, and to share the sort of insights and experience that they'd had and the success factors so that people better understood going forward. One of the third things we wanted to do was to highlight this capability piece, and we did that in two ways. First of all, we talked about the need for companies to build their Asia capability to ensure their success. Because quite frankly, you know, it's probably not the best analogy, but if you get on a tennis court with a pair of shoes and a racket, that's great, but you might not know how to play tennis. Actually pausing and thinking about the capabilities that we need is really important. I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on what we think business can do, but I would note that we have a fantastic growing Indian diaspora in Australia, and many, many Australians of Indian background who can be a huge asset in building that deep cultural capability and market knowledge for Australian companies. The last thing that we focused on in the report in terms of key messages for business was trying to encourage Australian business to think differently about investing, not just in their Asia capabilities, but in the way that they understand the regulatory, political, and broader business context in the markets where they show up. And part of that is actually investing strongly in a corporate affairs capacity and in government relations, something that Australian companies have tended not to do so much in the past.
Right, I think that's a great point to make, and even you know what you mentioned about the Indian diaspora. You know, we always say that it's like a potent force and it needs to be utilized. 700,000 you know, Indian diaspora in Australia, and called the living bridge between both nations. You know, the kind of skill sets and having worked in the Indian setup and then coming here and settling down here can be utilized for, you know, for their board experience for companies as well. What's your assessment of the Australia-India ties? Because this is a great time for Australia-India relations. We saw the virtual summit between both prime ministers in June, but reciprocity and mutual promise is at the very core of any relationship. And we have seen that perception, the kind of perception people have about this relationship. How do you see in this particular global reality, in the changed COVID world we are living, what sort of engagement can we expect between both countries?
I think one of the interesting things about the whole period of the global pandemic has been, when we think about the big geostrategic and economic picture in the region, many of the underlying trends have really accelerated quite rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
One of those has been the sort of geostrategic balance in the region. Very much the US-China relationship and tensions has continued to be an important context, and sharpened tensions there have really redrawn the map in many ways. I think the third thing that's been really noticeable during COVID is the underlying strength of the economies in Asia, despite the quite tough hit of COVID, is still clear. And while it might not be as fast a glide path forward, the reality is that sort of center of global economic activity has firmly shifted and will continue to shift to the Indo-Pacific. In terms of the implications for the Australia-India relationship, as you pointed out, we're in a very positive phase in the relationship. We've had excellent summits between prime ministers. We've had a presidential visit to Australia by the Indian president, which was an excellent opportunity. We have new agreements, including efforts to enhance the Quad, which is a security arrangement which involves India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. And most recently, we've got some great trilateral initiatives, including the Indonesia-Australia initiative. And those new collaborative arrangements, I think, are a great opportunity for, in the regional context, both India and Australia to work more closely bilaterally and to be stepping up as middle powers to play an important balancing role in this really uncertain period.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the economic front, what's been really encouraging in the relationship is that both governments have committed comprehensively in a very public manner to economic deepening. We've had the report written by Peter Varghese on Australia's India economic strategy. We've had Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, also a former senior diplomat and Foreign Secretary in India, lead respective efforts to develop economic roadmaps, not FTAs, and that's quite important, economic roadmaps on both sides that will lead to better trade and, most importantly, investment ties. Those reports have taken considerable time. They provide incredibly valuable roadmaps for the business community in both countries. So I think basically we have huge, in this time of COVID, there are big shifts, but we've got huge assets in both the political and strategic relationship between Australia and India, and very importantly, the economic relationship, have got fantastic buy-in at the most senior levels in both governments, and the framing and the context in which our two communities can come closer is there.
That's very true, and it's one of its kind report. Peter Varghese's India Economic Strategy 2035 and the reciprocal strategy by Ambassador Anil Wadhwa. The first time Indian government has taken any such report or has initiated any such report. So it's quite remarkable, and then also shows the intent in building the Australia-India ties. You mentioned middle powers, and it's interesting that we are seeing the supply chain initiative between Japan, Australia, and India. So lots happening in this space, and let's hope that we actually see this translating into economic. Achieving our economic goals with each other also, which has been somewhere lacking in the last few years. Moving forward, in a lot of your conversations and your writings, you've mentioned about advancing women in business and making it more gender inclusive. how do you see the business landscape changing today and accepting more women in businesses?
So that's a great question, Natasha. And as you know, I'm personally deeply passionate about diversity and about women in leadership. I think it's interesting. The first thing that we can do to ensure that we actually have greater gender diversity in across our community, not just in our corporations, but across our community and in business, is to recognize the data and to actually recognize we've got a problem. Both India and Australia are in a situation where women do not participate in the labour force at the same level as men. They tend to often, in India's case, work in the informal sector. In Australia, many more women are in part-time or casual work. And at the top of corporations, while Australia has made some progress, as has India, women are, in Australia, we've just touched down at 30% of board members are women. I think in India, the number is still fewer than 10%. And when we look at senior leadership in corporations and at the C-suite, women remain systematically underrepresented in both countries. So what do? We're really upfront about the issue. And we know the data. That's the first thing that we do. And people always say that's because you're an economist. It's not. I think if you don't measure it, the problem doesn't exist. Measure it and then think about it. The second thing that we can do, and this has become really important in the time of COVID, is we need to provide work environments in which everybody can be their best selves and they can show up in the way that makes the most sense to them. And traditionally, there's been a lot of discussion about, oh, well, you know, that means for women are going to have children and we have to think about children and we have to think about, you know, maternity leave. I think what is actually more important than taking that lens around what are the kind of concrete measures we have to put in place, we have to assume that corporations and governments know about equity measures. We need to think about what is the environment and what is the cultural context in which people can come forward and become leaders. One of the interesting things that came up in a discussion we were having amongst a group of senior women leaders the other day across the region was in COVID, many people have had to move back into into home-based work. That's utterly changed the childcare equation. It's actually meant that men are working from home. So it's removed commuting. It's actually really leveled up the playing field in many ways, as well as causing additional stress and burdens, of course, with homeschooling and other issues. However, it has leveled things up. One of the senior women leaders in the region noted that from a cultural perspective, actually using digital platforms like the Zoom we're using today has actually meant that it's easier for women to step in to the conversation and easier to show up, easier to have your voice heard, easier to have your perspective recognized. So in fact, COVID has really changed the rules in some positive ways, despite the negative impacts it has also had economically on women. I think the third thing that we can really do to drive gender diversity and women's leadership in our organizations is to actively create opportunities for our younger women. And here I'm not just talking about having dedicated training programs for women or women's leadership programs. One of the most noticeable things that people often don't think about is in your corporation, you might be running a training program on, you know, leadership for mid-level executives or accounting for non-accountants, or more and more importantly in the digital environment, human-centered design or coding. Actually, women are often not showing up in those sorts of career-enhancing opportunities at the same rate as their male counterparts. And thinking twice about that and being really deliberate about making sure that women are building the same capabilities and therefore have access to the same long-term opportunities is very important. Do you mind if I say one specific thing about the digital economy opportunity?
Yes, sure, please.
One of the things that I've been quite shocked to discover returning to Australia, and then I have looked at these issues much more broadly across the region, is while COVID has rapidly accelerated digitization of, of the workplace, and of course we all know that Industrial Revolution 4.0, 5.0 is going to require really fundamentally different levels of knowledge and capability and technology, whether that's, AI, whether it's machine learning, whatever. But women are so underrepresented at school, at university, and in our STEM labour force. While we might have made it to 30% of women on boards, we're still languishing at 17% of STEM graduates in Australia are women.
Yeah.
Well, quite frankly, if our whole economic future is going to be technology dependent, then women are just not developing the capabilities in the numbers that they're going to need fast enough to be able to make the most of that opportunity. So I actually think one area which we really need to urgently do more work is ensuring that there are more girls and women studying STEM, building those skills, and then taking up careers in the STEM area. And traditionally, many of the sectors in STEM have not been very female friendly.
True.
So taking that gendered lens and thinking we can't disadvantage half of humanity in the new economy. We've got to absolutely get to this and get to it really fast.
And the fact that we are having these discussions, because one strength area is that when you start talking about issues, the apathy gets converted into empathy, and that is something which
way of thinking,
which needs to change. And there are inherent biases, and I also feel it's important for men to be talking more about women empowerment and gender and making it more inclusive, not just women. So that's something which also needs to be a part of most of our discussions. Coming back to the issue of because I understand that we are racing against time now. What sort of skills, in your opinion, will really be of very big value in the changed business landscape today? With COVID really changing the dimensions and paradigms of engagement across different fields. What do you think will be very important? What sort of skills do we really need now?
It's really interesting. I was speaking to a senior Australian business leader about this recently, and interestingly, he said almost exactly the same as a senior Indian business leader who I heard address a women's conference some years ago, and who was with Deutsche Bank globally. And both of them said three things. The modern skills that we need, and this was pre-COVID actually, the modern skills that we as business leaders are looking for in our talent. Three things. Number one, an ability to build productive relationships, an ability to connect, to be able to be sympathetic interculturally, and to navigate, different cultural contexts. We're really looking for communicators and connectors. The second thing that both of them said was, oddly enough, while it's pretty rare, I need someone who can read a balance sheet, economic literacy. The third thing that they said, both of them, was actually, while it wasn't essential, a second language capability was really important. The last thing that I would add from my own perspective and from what I've just spoken about with the COVID experience is one of those essential skills for the future is digital literacy and deep technology knowledge. And we can't all have that. I mean, literally as I'm saying this, I can feel people saying, oh, that's just aspirational. Well, quite frankly, in some communities, it was aspirational to reach 70%, literacy on basic numeracy. We actually have to shift these goalposts. And while right now it might feel like a very big aspiration, we actually need to aspire to develop those modern skills. So I think it was really interesting hearing from those senior business leaders, and I honestly couldn't disagree with them. It was fascinating hearing the senior Deutsche Bank leader say he was asked constantly by young people, which degree should I do and which MBA is better? And he said, every time I give this speech and I tell people, it's not that your MBA is not important. Actually, you can be the smartest person in the room. I'm looking for something different. True. I think that's really important for all of us to recognize.
True. I'm glad that you made you made this point, because it's so pertinent, and especially in the times we are living in, it teaches us that all that you need is how to cope up in situations like these. You might be coming out of Harvard or Yale, but if you don't know how to cope up in situations in these unprecedented times, everything becomes so challenging. My final question to you, and I'm so tempted to take this conversation, for the next one whole hour. I understand. So my final question to you, Penny, talking about the Australia-India economic engagement, we always largely talk about a very transactional relationship. How do we shift this relationship to a more dependable partnership? And what suggestions would you give to Australian businesses who want to expand to India, what they should know about India, what they should be doing right in India, and how they should change this whole, the anecdotal assumption which they have about India, how that should be changed?
Great question. And if I had a magic wand, I'd just wave it right now. I was a little disappointed to learn recently that actually Australia-India trade has contracted this year. And as I was reading the data, as myself a very strong proponent of the relationship, I was shocked. So I do think there are some really important things we can do. The first is actually build your knowledge and understanding of the market. We do have these great bilateral strategies, which are really helpful, but there is nothing like showing up, investing the time, learning, and then getting really granular insight on the sector and the state, because I think the state-based approach is a really smart one, as suggested by Peter Varghese. Let's build that insight. The second thing that's really important is build the relationships, actually. And back to my earlier point on the Indian diaspora and Asia capability, build your relationships and find the talent, surround yourself with the talent that can help you navigate the cultural context. Do that really deliberately, because it is a fundamentally different cultural context. And to be successful, you need to acknowledge that and then navigate it, and actually navigate it with grace. And that's not something we always think about. I am going to make a point that came through in our Winning in Asia report about how to do business in the region. And I think particularly in countries like India, it's really important that Australian business understands the policy context and the priorities of the government and the community, and shows up not in a transactional way, but in a way where we're looking for mutual advantage, mutual interest, and can actually help India and the community deliver against its own priorities. I'm going to give you one very brief example of that. In one of my corporate roles, I worked for Visa, the global payments company, at the time when India went through the process of demonetization. And that was a major shock to the Indian economy, and required on the part of government, as part of its big rapid digitization strategy, to think totally differently about what levers it could pull and how it could help communities writ large and businesses, particularly smaller businesses, develop the digital literacy that they needed to navigate, you know, a less cash-based economy. So what Visa did in that environment is we teamed up with McKinsey and Company, the global management consulting firm, and with the government of Andhra Pradesh to work in a town called Vizag, and we developed together a blueprint for how to digitize a city rapidly at scale for digital payments. And it took us about 18 months to do that work. We researched and then we did. We worked in partnership with banks, with the transport companies, with local government. And as we went, we managed to digitize rapidly, I think nearly 80% of all payments in Vizag. But when we developed a blueprint for how to do this, we then took it back to the Indian government and said, here, this is to help the next 10, 50, 200 cities to do this and do this at scale. And we will actually help you do that. Now, that is the kind of contribution to helping the national interest, enabling communities, which is win-win, but fundamentally recognizes that the environment in that case that Visa was working in was very different to what it was used to, but one in which we could step up and do great business, but help meet a need.
Yeah. And I think, I'm glad you made, the point around policy, because, as a policy professional previously, I understand the very, importance of how policies change all the time. And if you miss on those changes, the reforms, the tweaks that happen across different states, also at the center level, at the state level, then you tend to lose out also on the benefits that businesses might get of these changes. And of course, demonetization was actually, a historical moment for people who were at that time in India. And of course, they struggled. But then what also happened was, this whole move towards digital India. And,
which was fantastic.
And we actually seem to have benefited out of it, with this whole COVID crisis. The beneficiaries, especially the rural sector, has benefited because there were digital accounts which were already created, 3 years ago.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, that the whole digital India policy was visionary, and moving to implement that policy, including through the payments sector, absolutely vital. And it has revolutionized the way in which rural communities engage, with the banking system. It's changed financial inclusion. It's actually changed things like agricultural supply chains. So understanding that context is super important. Another really important policy context and policy change in India that's relevant for Australia is the new education bill. And that is going to create huge opportunity, hopefully, for further growing the really important Australia-India education relationship.
Very true. Thanks very much, Penny, for joining us in this very insightful conversation, your thoughts across different sectors, and of course, how we can really, push Australia-India relationship to a higher trajectory of growth, of prosperity, and of course, across three different segments of people-to-people ties, strategic ties, economic ties. Thank you very much. That was very insightful. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.